Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm your host, Scott Spratt from Sports Info Solutions. I'm joined, as always, by Aaron Schatz of Football Outsiders. Aaron, sorry we couldn't get on the same page last week. I hope that you're feeling better.
Yes, the sickness is gone. Down with the sickness. I think that would make a good song title even.
Yeah, that's really catchy. I'm surprised no one's ever thought of that before.
Yeah, probably not.
My colleague Joe Rosales, I think, did a really nice job of filling in for me last week, and I'm sure we'll have him back again. Joe, if you're listening, just wanted to let you know that despite another tough loss for the Panthers, I'm done crying into the microphone, and I'm going to rebound and talk football with you today, Aaron, okay?
All right, we will not talk too much Panthers today. We'll figure out what's up with them. I think there's going to be a little bit of a coming back for them, I think.
Okay, I hope so. We'll talk about it in future weeks if there is not. But I want to get started with another team that's, I think, pretty interesting and kind of similar style of a team as the Panthers, or at least they were last year, the Seattle Seahawks. With the updated DVOA rankings that you guys put out last week, and I do want to point out, Aaron, you should probably spend a minute talking about this. Starting with the Week 5 DVOA rankings, there are opponent adjustments being made, correct?
Yes, so after 4 weeks of the season, that's enough data for us to start doing opponent adjustments, and they come in at about 40% of what their eventual strength will be, and then it goes up each week till we get to Week 10. But this is the first week that we do have opponent adjustments in there. And it's sort of a tough thing because we've often been asked why we don't do opponent adjustments earlier in the season, and it's because you don't have the sample size. Now, we could do opponent adjustments based on what our projections are, but first of all, that's kind of complicated to program.
Yeah.
And right, so ESPN, for example, just introduced that with their QBR. But ESPN has a stats and analysis group that's like 20 people, including like a dozen programmers. And Football Outsiders has me.
True. You're worth at least two people there, Aaron. At least two.
Though, is the team's not doing what we think they're going to do, right? So, like, if we had been adjusting based on projections, playing Arizona would look really, really tough. But Arizona's offense hasn't looked that good this year,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just probably smart that you guys strike that happy medium. And, I mean, at the end, at least right now, it seems like the rankings match up logically, mostly. Just mentioning the top four overall in DVOA, 3 of those top 4 are the undefeated teams. The Eagles are number 1, Vikings number 3, and Broncos are number 4. That sort of leaves one party crasher at number 2, though, which is the Seattle Seahawks. You mentioned in your article that the DVOA tends to be a big fan of the Seahawks. And again, I think it seems a little bit counterintuitive based on some of the other principal things going on with the team, and I'd like to talk about those. So let's start with the fact that the Seahawks have played one of the easiest schedules in the league so far. Their 3 wins are over the Dolphins. They're 22nd in DVOA. The 49ers, they're 28th in DVOA. And the Jets, who are 32nd in DVOA. And even their losses against the Rams are 24th in DVOA. So explain to me, Aaron, how come the softness, so to speak, of the schedule isn't causing the Seahawks to fall a little bit further in the rankings?
Well, first of all, as far as the being party crashers, certainly in past years, it's not always that the undefeated teams are the top teams. So it's not that weird to have a 3-1 team mixed with the 4-0.
Definitely, very true.
Seattle it's funny because if you look at the table on Football Outsiders, despite the fact that they've played the easiest schedule in the league so far, their DVOA is higher than their VOA. If we include in VOA fumbles only counting if you recover them.
Oh.
So that's one of the hidden secrets of the Seahawks this year. The Seahawks have fumbled 4 times on offense and only recovered 1 of them. And they've forced 4 fumbles on defense, and they haven't recovered any of them.
Wow.
So the easy schedule that the Seahawks have played is balanced by the fact that they've had horrific luck on fumble recoveries this year. And as far as the game-by-game goes, the single-game ratings, the Miami win looks a little odd. It's odd that their rating for that game is high. It's like 40%. Given how bad Miami is, to beat them by 2 points, the system believes that they absolutely outplayed the Dolphins and they just didn't score points. They had 352 yards in that game, and the Dolphins had 214, right? That's like a
That's a huge difference. Yes.
But the other two games, I mean, they really hammered the 49ers, and they really hammered the Jets. It was not as close as the 27-17 score. So this is a team that essentially has played two huge wins, one win that's bigger than it looks, and then a close loss. That's a really good team.
Yeah. And, it's not really surprising that the Seahawks are at the top of the list. I think we all expected that going into the year. And even by Dave, the Seahawks are the number one team. So that's the one that includes some of the preseason projections in the mix. But just seeing the Seahawks play, it seems like they have the same number one problem that they had last year, which is offensive line play. Wilson has actually been under pressure on a higher percentage of his dropbacks than any other quarterback. So, I mean, it's the sort of thing where you keep expecting it to be a major problem for the team, but they seem to overcome it consistently. Is it the sort of thing that against maybe some stiffer competition the rest of the season will cause a real problem for them, or is it something that somehow they're scheming for or that Wilson himself is able to overcome because of his own particular gifts?
Wilson overcomes it for the most part. Look, it would be better if they had better offensive line play. I mean,
Sure.
It's terrible, and we knew it was going to be terrible. And surprise, it's terrible. Now, it's been better the last couple of weeks because their offense has gone from 27th in DVOA after week 2 to where it is now 17th. Right, so that's been a little bit of improvement, and they got a German Ifedi, whose name I'm probably mispronouncing in some horrible fashion, back from injury over the last couple weeks. But I don't think that the Seattle offense would necessarily work with most other quarterbacks. I think it would work with Cam Newton.
Yeah,
I think it would work with, you need a guy who's a mobile quarterback, because there's two things. The first is Wilson's ability to throw on the run and when he's outside the pocket, which allows him to continue plays after a breakdown. And the other is that Wilson sort of serves as an extra blocker on running plays, because his presence and his ability to run sort of forces the defense to dedicate a defender to him that doesn't then have to really be blocked.
Yeah.
And that opens things up for the running game. So even if you had a quarterback like Roethlisberger or Romo who succeeds outside the pocket, they wouldn't present the same running threat that Wilson does. So, I mean, I think like Andrew Luck could run this offense. But if you put Breeze or Brady or I'm trying to think of a less mobile, younger quarterback.
Yeah, a lot of younger guys are actually fairly mobile.
We haven't seen him playing yet, but Jared Goff.
Sure.
Behind that offensive line, oh my God. Maybe that's why the Rams aren't playing Jared Goff yet, because their offensive line is also playing terribly. Just read today's film room from Kean Fahey about how Todd Gurley gets no yardage because they can't block for him. If you put an immobile quarterback behind that line, it wouldn't do as good. It would shut down their run game, and the passing game would also have problems.
It's so interesting just to think that like they were able to get Wilson so late in that draft, and he's been such a perfect fit for that team that, yeah, I guess they really are pretty amazing.
Yeah, David Carr. That's a younger quarterback who's not really mobile, who would struggle behind that offensive line.
Excellent segue, Aaron. It's like you planned it. Because the next topic that we wanted to talk about was three teams that they're behind those elite defensive-minded teams like the Seahawks and Eagles and Vikings and Broncos, but they're still ranked very high in DVOA despite an extreme offense skew. We've talked about one of these teams, the Dallas Cowboys, in previous weeks, and the Cowboys are third in offensive DVOA and 23rd in defensive DVOA. But I also want to talk about the Raiders, who were second in offensive DVOA and 29th in defensive DVOA, and the Falcons, who were first and 31st, being the most extreme of the splits, I suppose. Let's start with the Raiders, who you were just mentioning there. Aaron, why aren't the Raiders better on defense? They were number 15 last year, and they added some talent in the offseason with Bruce Irvin and Sean Smith. It seems like they should be better.
The first thing I'm going to say is that it's kind of interesting. Normally, in the recent past, these teams that have been very strong on offense and poor on defense have been the best teams in the league. in general. Like a lot of these teams have been among the best teams in the league despite being imbalanced. And the last 2 years, it's the opposite. It's the teams that are really strong on defense and mediocre on offense that are near the top of the league. And these offense-focused teams are not because of this weird thing in the last 2 years where the strongest defenses have been stronger than the strongest offenses. As far as the Raiders go, I think they miss Mario Edwards a lot because they're not getting sacks. And his injury is a problem. They're 26th in adjusted sack rate. And so the pass pressure is not as much as they would like it to be, although it's more than that sack rate would indicate, right?
Yeah, because I think they're middle of the pack in pressure rate. But, I mean, middle of the pack is what they were basically last year. With some of the talent on the team, it seems like they should be better. Sean
Smith has not played, I think, up to his previous caliber of play. I think that's part of it also. So if we look at I'm loading up right now, actually, the premium charting data that we have now through Sports Info Solutions on Football Outsiders. And, just a little ad reminder for people that's $25 to get all these charting stats updated every week through the end of the year. And if we look at Oakland, we have David Amerson playing very well. He's 8th so far in yards per pass and success rate, which is like, where did that come from?
Yeah.
Because he struggled so much back when he was in Washington. But Sean Smith is 53rd in yards allowed per pass and 38 in success rate. So he has not played as well as I think Oakland would have expected. The other thing about Oakland's defense is that they really struggle against the run. They're 29th in run DVOA. And, they're 28th against the pass, so they're not good at either, but you can pretty much do whatever you want to them, offense, running or passing. And so they really struggle. I do think schedule is part of it too, though, because we haven't kicked in the full opponent adjustments yet. They've played the number 27 defensive schedule this year. Anybody who's had New Orleans on their schedule, basically,
it's not ideal.
Better on offense and worse on defense than they probably actually are.
For sure. Let's talk a little bit about Derek Carr too. You brought him up a second ago. His numbers look really good this year. His completion percentage is up from 61.1% last year to 68%. Pretty much all across the board, his numbers look really strong. Do you think Carr is making the leap?
He's playing really well. Did we have had a lot of trouble this year and had a lot of arguments with folks on the internet on the subject of how much credit do you give quarterbacks who throw mostly short passes? For example, we know that ESPN and their QBR stat splits passes based on the air yards and the yards after catch and gives quarterbacks less credit for short passes than for deep passes and tends to credit the idea of the yards after catch more to the receivers. And what we have a lot this year are quarterbacks who are having surprising success early on, young quarterbacks, who are doing it primarily with a short horizontal passing game. So the NFL average for air yards is 8.4 yards per pass. But David Carr is at 7.65.
Yeah.
And Dak Prescott is 7.6, and Carson Wentz is 6.9. So all of these guys, and yet those are like they're like 3rd, 4th, and 5th in DVOA, passing DVOA this year. So it's this real question of how much credit do we want to give guys for excelling in essentially horizontal offenses, right? I mean, so Oakland, like Amari Cooper is the deep threat, but he hasn't been that good this year. They're not getting him the ball, but they're getting it a ton to Michael Crabtree, who's the shorter possession guy. It's really kind of hard to figure out whether this is a leap from Carr or whether this is going to come back to earth a bit, or is it going to continue at this level, but he's not really responsible for it, right? Or he's not fully responsible for it. It's like one of the big questions I think we need to really explore in the next couple of years is how much credit do we give to quarterbacks who primarily throw short?
It's funny how all of this sort of interacts with each other, because the point that I was going to bring up was that their offensive line is played very well. Carr's only been sacked twice so far this year. I think he was sacked like 32 times last year. And their offensive line is allowing the lowest pressure rate in the league. But maybe that is also scheme related. If he's back there throwing quick, short passes, then it's going to take, less time to protect him. So maybe it's all kind of working together in a way that's being effective for the team.
Right. I mean, look, we know Oakland has a good offensive line. They did last year, and they do this year. They're number one in adjusted sack rate. They're ninth in adjusted line yards. But I do think that there is something to the idea that the scheme is part of that he's not holding on to the ball so that Amari Cooper can get 25 yards downfield.
So I'm curious then for your thoughts on the Atlanta Falcons, because they're another team that has really improved offensively. I mean, they were good last year, but Matt Ryan's numbers are pretty incredible right now. Completion rate is up to 72.1%. That's more or less 5% higher than it's been in each of the recent 4 seasons. His yards per attempt are up from 7.5 to 10.5.
Yeah, so, he's not doing this with throwing short.
Pretty impressive overall. Obviously, he victimized the Panthers pretty heavily, but Ryan's in his 9th year in the league. It seems silly to ask whether he's making the leap, but do you have any thoughts on why it is that he's been so good and the Falcons have been so good offensively?
Maybe leap is the wrong word. Maybe just having his best season, right? It's a little bit more subdued way to say the same thing. It's interesting that Julio Jones, despite the 300 yards, is a smaller percentage of the Atlanta passing game this year than he was last year, and that's a good thing for them, right? They're getting more out of the secondary receiving weapons. And a lot of it's the ground game. Devonta Freeman and Tevin Coleman have been very good both as rushers and receivers, and I think that's a big part of what their offense is doing.
It was interesting because watching them play the Panthers, the thing that sort of stood out to me visually was that they were not having any problems handling the Panthers' pressure. But what I've discovered in the charting data was the Panthers actually were getting quite a bit of pressure on them. The Falcons saw the second most pressure by rate of any team last week. But those basically didn't ever turn into sacks. I think K'Wan Short had a couple of late ones, but the game was already decided at that point. So I don't know, Aaron. Like, do you think that their offensive line is really good, or is it just the sort of situation where maybe the actual production in terms of sacks and stuff haven't quite equalized yet based on the pressure rates?
It's playing well. Schrader is good, right? The right tackle. And, I was talking to Doug Farrar about Alex Mack this week. He's doing the Bleacher Report's doing that NFL 1000 thing where they have a bunch of people scouting players every week. It's more of a scouting thing than a stats thing, but he had Alex Mack as his number 1 center for week 4. And when I was trying to decide which offensive lineman we were going to do for the Football Outsiders Madden Ultimate Team cards, we ended up not doing Mack because the things that Doug said to me about Mack were not something that I could easily put on, in 2 sentences on the back of a thing on Madden Ultimate Team. But he said basically that Mack had his best game, that he really controlled short, and especially Latulele. He gave up a sack late, but that was late, right? I mean, otherwise, especially on running plays, was really, really controlling. So I think Mack has been a big improvement for them to get him at center over whatever they had before, Joe Hawley or whatever they were doing last year. That's a big plus, and I think that that's a big part of what the Atlanta offense is getting because Ryan, there may be pressure, but maybe part of the reason why there's pressure is because they are running deeper routes, which means there's more time for the pressure to get there.
True.
But he's hitting those deeper routes, especially to Julio.
Yeah, and I talked to one of the scouts that scored that game for us, and he mentioned that Ryan was doing a really good job of sort of getting out of the pocket when it was the right time to do that. And he was completing those passes too. So it seems like they're pretty much firing on all cylinders as an offense.
Unfortunately, on defense, they're not. And I will promote that there will be an ESPN Insider article by Sterling Z on Friday that will talk about can the Atlanta offense keep this up? Probably. And can the Atlanta defense get better? Probably not.
Well, at least I have a little bit of hope then for the rest of the season, Aaron. So we talked about the Cowboys, I think, even last week, but let's talk about them a little bit more because they fall into this group with the Falcons and the Raiders. The running game has really sort of turned it on over the last 2 weeks, and Ezekiel Elliott has gotten 138 and 140 yards in those last 2 games. But one thing that stood out to me in that charting data that you mentioned earlier that you can get on footballoutsiders.com, Elliott has just 13 broken tackles on 100 touches. So that's a 13% broken tackle rate. That's well short of the leaders. I think David Johnson is leading among the primary backs at 35%, but there are a lot of guys north of 20%. Do you think that low broken tackle rate is a reflection of Elliott's quality of play? And so I'm sort of obliquely asking whether their offensive line is doing basically all of the work for Elliott, or do you think that that's somehow a reflection of Elliott's style of play?
I think it's a combination. First of all, Dallas is number 1 in the league in adjusted line yards, and that is such a good offensive line that obviously that's a big part of it. However, I think also, just speaking anecdotally from the Dallas games that I've watched, he pushes Pyle a lot.
Yeah.
And we have yet to figure out how to mark that in charting. We actually had this problem when it was Football Outsiders volunteer charters before Sports Info Solutions took it over for us. And I think continue to have this problem, which is it's not a broken tackle if you push Pyle. How do you mark pushing Pyle? But he does that. He seems to drag the Pyle for an extra couple yards on a lot of plays. So I think that's sort of the combination, is that he's more of a pile pusher than a tackle breaker, and that offensive line is stellar.
Yeah. As far as the quarterback goes, do you think that Tony Romo needs to start being worried about getting, I called it Tom Brady, maybe Wally Pipp is the way to go, but by Dak Prescott?
It's an interesting question because it ties back into what I just said 5 minutes ago regarding the length of passes.
Yeah.
Right, Scott Kasbar is taking it hard from Eagles fans about commentary on Carson Wentz. I wouldn't even say criticism of Carson Wentz. Commentary that is seen as criticism, which is that Carson Wentz has been throwing really short passes. And oh my God, Carson Wentz has been throwing his average pass is really short. Prescott's is longer, but like Derek, whichever Carr brother it is, I always screw that up.
Derek. I think.
Didn't I say David earlier in the podcast?
You did.
I totally did.
Yeah.
It's lower than the NFL average. And so I think that it's less likely that he's going to be quote-unquote Tom Brady, because I think that there will be a feeling that Romo can build more of a downfield offense. And that Prescott is looking good in part because he's gotten so much help from that offensive line in the running game. When you go back and you read what people wrote about the Patriots in 2001, there was this sense in the preseason that Belichick really liked Brady and couldn't figure out what to do about the fact that Bledsoe was so highly paid. I don't think that there's the same sense in Dallas.
No.
Now, maybe if this had happened next year and they'd had Prescott in camp for a year, and Prescott, in practices was impressing them as much as Brady impressed Belichick in the 2000 practices, right? So much so that the Patriots actually, carried 4 quarterbacks in 2000. Maybe we would be saying this, but I don't know if we're at that point yet. All indications are that they want to give Romo the job back in week 8. They think he'll be back in week 8. They want to give him the job back. But I don't know if he's going to carry it the whole year, because I don't know if his back can hold up for the whole year.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised to see Prescott again before the year is over. And I wouldn't be surprised to see them make some decisions in the offseason towards pushing Romo out and moving on to the next stage in that team's development.
Well, Aaron, I hate to end the podcast on a sour note, but I think we do need to talk about the Jets because they've been pretty bad. They're actually the number 32 ranked team in DVOA right now. So, yes, that means they're below the Browns. The Football Outsiders projections in the preseason had them 18th, so it's not like we didn't see this coming to a certain extent. But I think there are a lot of people just in general that thought that this might be a real playoff contender. I mean, they went 10-6 last year. So, how much has this sort of fall been directly attributable to Ryan Fitzpatrick, who's been turning the ball over just a lot? 10 interceptions and 4 fumbles so far this season.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't see this coming. I thought they weren't going to be as good as they were last year, that there would be some regression, particularly on the offense, that Fitzpatrick wouldn't be as good as last year. But I didn't see 6 picks in a game.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
I didn't see bottom 5 on both offense and defense. I think his poor play is a lot of it, but at the same time, that Kansas City game, I mean, was lost. Like, when he started throwing all the picks, it was already lost. He was just forcing the ball, just desperate to make something happen, and just forced it really badly.
Yeah.
Much worse than it happens for anybody else. But, I mean, there's no question he's not playing as well as last year. The receivers are not – Decker's not healthy. That's a problem, right?
Yeah, Marshall's been a little banged up too. I know he had the injury scare, I guess, with his knee, but Matt Forte too. So, yeah, there are quite a few injuries on this team.
The offensive line is actually doing fine despite the loss of Ferguson. They're 6th in adjusted line yards and 4th in adjusted sack rate.
And I was going to say their defensive line seems to still be fine looking at the pressure numbers. They trail only the Broncos so far this season, but like that's a weird
adjusted line yards.
That's a weird mismatch considering they're so bad in overall defensive DVOA. So I don't know. I feel like that might be correct.
Fire is having problems.
Yeah.
Gilchrist is not playing as well as last year. Marcus Williams is a real weakness. And look, I was Mr. on Twitter, Mr. Revis Defender, talking about how one or two blown plays on national television does not mean you've gone from a star to the worst player in the league.
Right.
And trying to explain to people, occasionally loudly in the Patriots press box, that there are in fact steps and adjectives that exist between Pro Bowler and disgusting excuse for a human being who should wither and die.
Wow, that's a little harsh.
There are adjectives and nouns, things that describe players between those two extremes. But Revis has not been good this year. The charting numbers on him have him out of the qualifying cornerbacks. He is 56th out of 64 in success rate, and he is dead last in yards allowed per pass. Thank you, Marquise Goodwin. And he is actually the only Jets cornerback who qualifies for the rankings in the game charting data that is on Football Outsiders. But we have Buster Skrine playing much better, but Marcus Williams' 39% success rate is worse than Revis's. So basically, the safeties are bad, and Revis has not been himself, and Marcus Williams is bad, and the linebackers aren't that great, and it's basically everything behind the front four.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess that's bad news for the Jets, but maybe things can turn a little bit around if they get into some more reasonable in-game situations than they were against the Chiefs. I guess we'll just have to see. Aaron, I think that's pretty much everything we wanted to cover today. Glad you're back and healthy. I hope that you enjoy having Tom Brady back in town. I'm sure the Pats will be happy to have him after last week. And otherwise, thanks everybody for listening. This has been the Off the Charts Football Podcast, and we'll be back around the same time again next week. Thanks so much.